Before we say a single word about what happened on that stage, we need to ask you to do one thing. If you have ever wondered whether it is too late to find someone, too late to be found, too late for the story to turn in a direction you stopped letting yourself imagine, please stay for every word of this. Because what you are about to hear is the answer to that question, given not by a philosopher or a therapist or a self-help book, but by a 60-year-old woman standing under the lights of a game show stage on a Thursday afternoon in February 2024, shaking from head to foot, looking at two people she had never met and recognizing them in the specific, wordless way we recognize the things that were always ours. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this channel is built on stories like this one, stories that do not ask you to suspend disbelief, but ask you instead to expand your understanding of what love is capable of across time. Stay with us. From the first sentence to the last, this story will hold you. Let it. 60 years is not a number, not really. Say it out loud and it sounds like a fact, something finite and countable, something you can put your hands around. 60 years. But live inside it. Live inside 60 years of a question that has no answer. 60 years of a face you have never seen that you nonetheless look for in every crowded room. 60 years of a birthday that comes around every August with the particular mix of gratitude and grief that belongs only to the people who were given away and learned, somehow, to be grateful and grieving at the same time. And you will understand that 60 years is not a number at all. It is a climate. It is the weather inside a person. It is what the inside of a life looks like when it is organized around a question that has never been answered and may never be. Evelyn Cross was 60 years old, and she had been living inside that climate since the day she was old enough to understand what adoption meant. Which was not, as these things often go, a single dramatic revelation, but a slow accumulation of understanding. A word overheard here, a question deflected there, a document glimpsed in a drawer that was closed before she could read it fully, a gradual assembling of the picture that she was not, biologically, where she had landed. Her adoptive parents, the Crosses of Hartford, Connecticut, were good people. That needs to be said plainly and held clearly throughout everything that follows, because it is true, and because Evelyn would say it herself without hesitation and with genuine warmth. Gerald and Margaret Cross had wanted a child for 7 years before Evelyn arrived. They had loved her with the specific, grateful ferocity of people who had waited a long time for something and understood its value. They had raised her well and carefully, and with great attention to the particular needs of a child who was, by temperament, more interior than they were, more given to quiet and to reading and to long, solitary walks that worried them slightly, until they understood that this was simply how Evelyn processed the world, not a symptom but a personality. She had been a happy child in the real sense of the word, not uncomplicated, not without the ordinary difficulties of growing up, but genuinely, foundationally happy, rooted in the love of two people who had chosen her as deliberately as any people have ever chosen anything. She knew this. She had always known this. She had also, from the age of about 9, known with equal certainty that somewhere in the world there were two people who had made a different choice, and that she had questions about them that her happiness did not make smaller. The happiness and the questions lived side by side in her, as they do for many adopted people, neither canceling the other out, both entirely real, both entirely hers. Gerald Cross died when Evelyn was 27. Margaret died 11 years later when Evelyn was 38. After Margaret's death, Evelyn had found, in a box in the back of the bedroom closet, the paperwork from the adoption. She had sat on the floor of her mother's bedroom with the box in her lap and read every document in it carefully, in the particular stillness of a person encountering a significant truth in an empty room with no one to manage their reaction for. The documents told her what her adoptive parents had known, that she had been born in Boston, Massachusetts on August 9, 1964, that her birth mother was 19 years old, that the father was listed as 21, that the adoption had been arranged through a private agency that no longer existed, that the names on the original birth certificate, which was sealed, were not included in the paperwork her parents had been given, that the trail, such as it was, began and ended in the same breath. She had wept on that floor for a long time, not only for the information or the lack of it, mostly for her mother, who had kept this box for 38 years, and who had never, not once in all that time, made Evelyn feel that the questions inside her were a threat to the love between them. She had wept for that specific, uncommon grace, and for the woman who had offered it, and for the fact that the woman was gone and could not be told one more time that it had mattered enormously. Evelyn had searched in the way people search in the era they are given. In the early 90s, she had registered with a mutual consent registry, a service that matched birth parents and adopted children who had both registered, a system that required both parties to want to be found in order to work. She had waited for a match that did not come, which meant either that her birth parents had not registered or that they had registered under information that did not align with hers, or any number of other explanations that all arrived at the same destination: silence. She had hired a researcher in 2001 who had made progress, had found the agency's successor organization, had located sealed court records, had gotten close enough that Evelyn had spent 3 weeks in a state of suspended anticipation that she later described as the most exhausting emotional experience of her adult life, and then encountered the legal wall that closed record adoption states had been building since the 1940s. Solid and impersonal and entirely indifferent to the human situations on either side of it. She had not given up. Giving up would have required a decision, a moment of choosing to stop, and Evelyn Cross had never arrived at that moment because the question never became small enough to leave behind. It was simply always there, manageable and present, like the weather you dress for rather than fight. She had built her life around it and within it and in spite of it. A life that was genuinely rich. A librarian for 31 years at a public library in Burlington, Vermont. A woman who had the particular gift of matching the right book to the right person at the right moment, which is not a small gift, but one of the most quietly significant a person can offer. She had been married for 22 years to a man named Paul, a high school history teacher who had proposed to her on a Tuesday evening in their apartment kitchen while she was making soup, and who was, in Evelyn's estimation, the person on earth she would most want in her corner in any situation requiring steadiness and good judgment, and the capacity to be genuinely interested in other people. They had 2 sons, Nathan and Eli. She had 4 grandchildren. She had a garden that produced more tomatoes than any 2 people could reasonably consume, which was fine because she gave them to the neighbors, and the neighbors gave her things in return, and this exchange of excess was, in Evelyn's view, one of the small, perfect architectures of community life. She was, by any measure, complete, and she was also, by the same measure, still carrying the question. Both of these things were true simultaneously and had been for 60 years, and Evelyn Cross had made a kind of peace with the fact that they might always be simultaneously true, that the question might simply be part of her for as long as she was herself. She had accepted this not with resignation, but with the particular grace of someone who has learned to hold difficult things without demanding that they resolve. The DNA test had been a birthday present from Nathan. Not this birthday, 3 years prior on her 57th birthday, offered with the slightly tentative energy of a son who was not entirely certain how his mother would receive it. "I know you've searched," he had said in the careful way he had of approaching things that mattered. "I know you've hit walls, but the technology is different now. The databases are bigger. It might find something the other searches couldn't." Evelyn had looked at her son for a moment. Then she had said, "All right," just that, all right. Nathan had looked slightly surprised by how simply she had said it, and she had understood his surprise and appreciated it, and had also known that the simplicity was not indifference but its opposite. She had been wanting to say all right to something for 60 years, and she was grateful to finally have something to say it to. The test had found matches. Not immediately. The first 8 months had produced the same distant cousin territory that Franklin Edwards had encountered, the genealogical echo of a biological family rather than the family itself. But the database was large and growing, and in the second year after the test, 2 things happened that changed the landscape. First, a closer match appeared, a woman listed as a probable first cousin, once removed, whose family tree, when Evelyn spent 3 careful evenings examining it, contained a branch that led to Boston, Massachusetts, 1964, and a family name she had never heard but which now felt, in the strange and specific way of discovered origins, as if it had always been there just outside her hearing. Second, that probable first cousin responded to Evelyn's tentative message within 48 hours with a warmth and an openness that made Evelyn sit very still at her kitchen table for a full minute before typing her reply, because warmth and openness from the direction of the question was not something she had learned to expect without preparation. The first cousin's name was Helen. Helen was 63 years old and lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and she was, it emerged over the course of several careful, increasingly candid emails and then 2 long phone calls, the daughter of a woman named Rosalie, who was the younger sister of a man named Thomas. who was 71 years old and lived in a suburb of Boston and had. Helen told Evelyn in the second phone call with a quiet directness that Evelyn would always be grateful for. Spent a very long time wondering about a daughter he had not raised. His name was Thomas Bellini. He was 21 years old in the summer of 1964. He and Evelyn's birth mother, a 19-year-old woman named Catherine who had grown up in the same neighborhood and who Thomas had loved in the way young people love when they are too young to know how to love carefully, had found themselves facing a situation that in 1964 had very few options and none of them comfortable. The decision to place the baby for adoption had not been made by Thomas and Catherine. It had been made by two sets of parents who were frightened and decisive and certain they were doing the right thing. Two families who looked at two young people who were not ready and a baby who deserved stability and drew a conclusion that felt, from the outside, logical and clean. From the inside, it had been neither. Thomas and Catherine had separated shortly after the adoption, under the weight of a grief that neither of them had been given language for, and that the adults around them had addressed primarily by encouraging them to move forward. Thomas had moved forward, in the sense that the years had passed. He had married in 1971, a woman named Barbara who was warm and practical and who knew about the baby from their first year together because Thomas was not able to carry it silently. He had two daughters with Barbara, now in their 40s, who had grown up knowing they had a half-sister somewhere in the world who they would probably never meet. Barbara had died of cancer in 2019, and Thomas, at 66, had found himself alone with the open question for the first time without the daily comfort of someone who knew it was there. He had searched. He had searched in the way available to a man of his generation and temperament, carefully, methodically, with a researcher, with a DNA test taken in 2020 at his daughter Maria's insistence, with the same registered services that Evelyn had been on for decades. The database had simply not connected them yet. The match had not appeared. And Thomas Bellini, 71 years old, a retired civil engineer with a vegetable garden and a Tuesday night poker game with friends he had known for 30 years and two daughters who loved him and four grandchildren who called him Nano, had been living in the same climate as Evelyn without either of them knowing that the other was out there, doing the same quiet, faithful work of carrying the question through a full and good life. The Family Feud producer who found this story was a woman named Simone, and she had found it the way Diane had found Tobias and Raymond had found Clara, and all these producers find the stories that change things through the network of human connection that exists underneath the visible surface of daily life. The web of people who mentioned something once to someone who remembered it later. Simone's path had gone through Helen, the first cousin in Providence, who had been corresponding with Evelyn for 8 months by the time Simone reached her, and who had also carefully and with Evelyn's knowledge and consent been in touch with Thomas. Helen had become, without entirely planning to, the thread that connected two people on opposite ends of the same silence. When Simone approached her, Helen had said one thing before anything else. "You have to do this right. These are not people who have been dramatic about this. They have been dignified about it for 60 years. Whatever you do has to be worthy of that." Simone had agreed. She had meant it. The same careful architecture went up. The counselors, the specialists, the preparation, the confirmed consent from every party, the consideration of every possible emotional outcome and how to support the people living through it. There was an additional layer of complexity in this case because there were two birth relatives rather than one. Thomas and Catherine had been located separately, and the question of whether they would both participate had required its own careful navigation. Catherine, now 60 years old herself and living in New Hampshire under a married name, had been contacted through Helen with tremendous delicacy. She was a grandmother now, a retired schoolteacher, a woman who had built a life that was full and real, and who had carried the question the way Thomas had carried it, quietly, faithfully, with no external drama and considerable internal weight. When Helen told her what was being proposed, Catherine had been silent on the phone for so long that Helen had said her name twice to make sure she was still there. Then Catherine had said in a voice that was steadier than Helen had expected, "I never stopped thinking about her, not for a single year." A pause. "Yes, tell me what you need from me." They had agreed, Thomas and Catherine, after a phone call with Simone that was facilitated by Helen, and that both of them described afterward as one of the stranger and more tender experiences of their lives. Two people in their 70s speaking to each other for the first time in decades about the child they had not raised, finding that the grief they had each carried separately had the same shape, as if it had always been one grief divided between two people who were not in the same room, to both be present. Not together, not at first, not in the same moment. Thomas would come first. Catherine would follow. The sequencing had been worked out with the care of people who understood that 60 years of separate histories could not be collapsed into a single moment without the risk of overwhelming everyone in ways that served none of them. The Family Feud application had been submitted on Evelyn's behalf by her son Nathan, who had the full knowledge of what was being arranged, and the enormous burden and privilege of keeping it from his mother for 4 months. Nathan was 34 years old and had his mother's interior quality, the same gift for sitting with difficult things without demanding that they resolve immediately, which was precisely what the 4 months of secret keeping required. His brother Eli, who was 31 and more expressive, had found the 4 months considerably more challenging. "I kept looking at her," Eli told a reporter afterward, "and thinking she has no idea. She's just living her life, making dinner, talking about the garden, and she has no idea what's coming. And I wanted to tell her so badly. Not to warn her, just because she deserved to know that someone had finally found something, that the question was going to get an answer. She deserved to know that." He paused. "But we held it because the moment was worth the waiting. The moment was worth everything." Evelyn had been delighted about the Family Feud application in the uncomplicated way she was delighted about things that were straightforwardly pleasant. She liked game shows. She liked the idea of doing something outside her ordinary life. She had packed for the trip to Los Angeles with the organized efficiency of a librarian who does not leave things to chance, had made Paul a detailed list of garden instructions in her absence, and had arrived at the studio on a Thursday morning in a rose-colored blouse and the pearl earrings she wore for occasions that felt like occasions, accompanied by Paul, Nathan, Eli, and her daughter-in-law, Jess. She was relaxed and present and entirely unsuspecting, and the production staff who interacted with her in the green room before the show, all of whom knew what was coming, found the experience of talking to her almost unbearably moving. This composed, warm, quietly remarkable woman making conversation about Vermont winters and library funding, and the particular challenges of growing heirloom tomatoes at altitude. Having absolutely no idea that 4 months of work and 60 years of waiting were both, right now, approaching their conclusion. On stage, the Cross family, Evelyn, Paul, Nathan, Eli, and Jess, was exactly what you would expect from a family shaped by decades of choosing each other carefully and finding, in each other's company, enough room to be fully themselves. They played with warmth and intelligence and a specific unhurried quality that felt almost out of place in the bright, urgent energy of a game show set, as if they had brought their own weather with them, and the weather was Vermont in early autumn, clear and cool and entirely comfortable. Steve Harvey loved them from the first minute. He told Evelyn, after she gave a particularly thoughtful answer in the second round, that she had the energy of someone who had read every book ever written and was therefore simply not surprised by anything. Evelyn had laughed at this, a full, genuine laugh, and said that was approximately correct, and that the ones that had surprised her were mostly thrillers from the 1970s. Steve Harvey had laughed in return, and the audience had laughed, and for a moment the studio was simply a room full of people enjoying each other's company on a Thursday afternoon. Steve Harvey was not simply enjoying the afternoon. He was managing, with the focused control of someone who has done this before and knows how much weight the next few minutes will carry, the last ordinary moments of a 60-year question. Every time Evelyn laughed, he felt the particular weight that Marcus Webb's collapse had taught him to feel, the weight of being the person who knows, in a room full of people who don't, that something is about to change. He looked at her between questions and saw a woman who was complete and good and entirely at peace with herself, and he thought about the thing she had been carrying for 60 years, the climate inside her, the question that had no name but had shaped everything, and he understood that what he was about to do was not intrude on that peace but fulfill it. That was the difference he had learned from all these moments to feel clearly. He was not about to disrupt something whole. He was about to complete something that had always been incomplete. Those are different things. They require different preparation. They produce different results. When the game ended, Steve asked the family to stay. The same quiet words, something special, just a moment. Evelyn tilted her head at him in the way she had, the librarian's alert, measuring regard, the look of a woman who notices when the energy in a room has shifted slightly and wants to understand why. She looked at Nathan. Nathan's face was doing things he was not successfully controlling. She looked at Paul. Paul met her eyes with the steady look of a man who knows something and has decided that the knowing is in this moment her husband's job to hold rather than share. Evelyn looked back at Steve Harvey. Something moved across her face, not understanding yet not belief, but the first quiet stirring of a possibility she had learned long ago to keep in a very protected place. The possibility she allowed herself only in the smallest hours, never in public, never where it could be seen. "Steve," she said carefully. "What is happening?" Steve Harvey looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it always had when the moment required his whole self rather than his professional self, quieter than usual, slower, shorn of performance. "Evelyn," he said, "I need you to know something before anything else. What this show has been part of arranging, with your son's help, with the help of people who love you, is something that we do not take lightly. Something we have spent months making sure was done right because you deserve for it to be done right." He paused. "You have been carrying a question for 60 years. We found the answer." Evelyn went completely still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement but the presence of something so large that the body suspends its ordinary activities to make room for it. Her hand found Paul's arm without looking. Her chin came up slightly. Her eyes, which were brown and steady and had seen 60 years of things, held on Steve Harvey's face without blinking. "Who?" she said. One word, just that. "Your birth father," Steve said. "His name is Thomas. He has been looking for you too." He paused. "He is here." Thomas Bellini walked out from the side of the stage. He was a tall man, slightly stooped in the way of tall men in their 70s who have spent decades accommodating a world built for shorter people, with white hair and the careful, deliberate walk of someone managing his own body in a moment of significant internal weather. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he was holding in his right hand a photograph. A small one, old, with the color bleed of early 1960s photography, which he had brought because Simone had asked him if there was anything he wanted to bring, and he had said, after a moment, that there was a photograph of himself and Catherine from the summer of 1964, taken a few months before Evelyn was born, and that he had carried it in his wallet for 53 years and he thought she might want to see it. He was not crying. He was doing the thing that people do when they are holding a very great emotion with very deliberate control, a slight tension around the eyes, a jaw that was working carefully, a quality of held breath. He walked to the center of the stage and he stopped. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at every face in every crowded room for 60 years, but different, not searching now, not scanning, but finding, seeing. And what she saw in the tall, white-haired man standing in the center of a game show stage holding a 53-year-old photograph was not a stranger. The body does not process biological recognition the way the mind processes information. It processes it the way it processes music or the smell of something from childhood, immediately, physically, below the level of argument, in the place where things are simply known before they are understood. Evelyn Cross looked at Thomas Bellini and knew him, not as the man he was, as the fact of him. As the source of the hands she had always had, the height she had always been, the specific quality of stillness that had defined her whole life and that she was looking at now, mirrored back to her from across a stage, worn differently but unmistakably the same. She walked toward him, not quickly, the way she did everything with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided and does not need to perform the deciding. She crossed the stage and she stood in front of this man she had never met and she looked up at his face, and she said in a voice that was entirely steady, that was the steadiest voice in the room, "Hello." And Thomas Bellini, 71 years old, who had been a civil engineer and a husband and a father and a grandfather, and who had for 53 years carried a photograph in his wallet and a question in his chest, said back, in a voice that was not steady at all, "Hello, Evelyn." And then she put her arms around him and he put his arms around her, and the room, the whole room, the audience and the production crew and the cameras and Steve Harvey himself simply stopped, the way a clock stops, the way a held breath stops, the way 60 years of open questions stop when they finally, completely receive their answer. The silence lasted longer than any silence Steve Harvey could remember on that stage, and he had been present for long silences. He stood at the side and let it last as long as it needed to last, because some things should not be moved along. Some things deserve to take exactly as much time as they need without anyone making the production decision to hurry them. He looked at Evelyn Cross, 60 years old, her face buried in the shoulder of a father she had never known, her arms holding on with the specific, total grip of someone who has finally found a thing they had given up calculating the coordinates of. And he felt something in himself that he would later struggle to describe because it was not a single emotion but a convergence of many, the way rivers converge. Grief and joy and relief and awe, and something that was simply the overwhelming, uncomplicated gratitude of being a human being in a room where something this true was happening. Thomas pulled back enough to look at her face. He held the photograph out to her. She took it with both hands and looked at it. Two young people in summer clothes, 1964, Boston, a world away and 60 years ago, and her face did something that no word fully covers. It completed. It became in that moment the face of a person who has the whole sentence. "You were so young," she said softly, not accusingly, not anything except accurately. Thomas nodded. "We were," he said. "We were very young and we didn't have a choice and I never," his voice broke cleanly, "I never stopped." Evelyn looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't. I could feel it. All my life I could feel that someone was out there not stopping." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at his daughter, who had his height and his stillness and 60 years of a life he had not been part of and who was standing in front of him now, complete and real and here. "I kept your birthday," he said. "August 9th, every year." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "My parents kept it too," she said. "My adoptive parents, August 9th." She paused. "There were more people keeping it than I knew." Steve Harvey moved into the circle of it then, gently, the way you enter a space that is sacred without disturbing what makes it sacred. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder and looked at Evelyn. "How are you doing?" he asked, simply and directly, the way he had learned to ask it, not as a host managing a moment, but as a person checking on another person. Evelyn considered the question with the librarian's honest seriousness. "I don't think I know yet," she said. "I think I will know for a long time." "I think I am going to be knowing this for the rest of my life," Steve nodded. "That sounds right," he said. Then he turned to address the room, the audience and the cameras and the 50 million people who would eventually watch this on a screen somewhere in the world. 60 years, he said. "I want everyone to hear that number. 60 years. This woman has been carrying a question for 60 years, and she carried it with grace. She didn't become bitter. She didn't close. She built a beautiful life. That man in the audience is her husband of 22 years. Those two young men on stage are her sons. There are 4 grandchildren at home in Vermont. She built all of that, and she still kept the question. She still kept the door open." He paused. "And her birth father on the other side of 60 years kept the same door open. Kept August 9th. Kept a photograph in his wallet for 53 years. These two people were faithful to each other across a distance neither of them chose." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I don't know what to call that. I know it's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever witnessed." Catherine came out 10 minutes later. The decision about how to handle this part of the reunion had been the most carefully considered of all. Catherine and Thomas had not been in the same room in over 40 years, and the addition of her to an already seismically charged moment required timing and support, and a specific kind of preparation for Evelyn, who had known Catherine was part of the story, but had not known until this moment whether she would be present. Simone had told Evelyn quietly just before Catherine walked out, so that she had 30 seconds of preparation rather than none. Evelyn had used those 30 seconds the way she used every interval, fully and without waste. She had taken a breath. She had looked at Thomas, who gave her the steady look of someone who had already spoken with Catherine that morning by phone and had said everything necessary. And then she had turned toward the side of the stage and waited. Catherine walked out with the specific, effortful composure of a woman who has had 60 years to prepare for a moment and has discovered, in the last 10 minutes of watching on a monitor, that 60 years of preparation is not quite enough. She was small, dark-haired, gone silver, with a face that showed everything she was managing not to show, which was considerable. She stopped a few feet from Evelyn and they looked at each other, two women of exactly the same age, one of whom had given and one of whom had been given, both of them having carried the same weight from different sides for the same 60 years. And there was a moment, just a moment, where no one in the room breathed. Then Catherine said, "I'm sorry," just that. 2 words offered not as an excuse or a defense or a request for anything in return, but as the simple true thing she had been waiting 60 years to say to someone who could receive it. Evelyn Cross looked at this woman, her birth mother, 60 years old, standing in front of her with everything visible on her face, and said, with a directness and a gentleness that the room felt like a physical event, I know you are, and I want you to know that I understand. I have had 60 years to understand, and I do." Catherine's composure broke then, completely all at once in the way that composure breaks when it has been maintained past the point of its capacity. She pressed both hands to her face. Evelyn stepped toward her and put her arms around her birth mother and held her, this woman who was half of the reason she existed, and Catherine held her daughter for the first time since the 11 days they had been in the same hospital room 60 years ago, and the room simply could not contain what was happening in it and stopped trying. Steve Harvey had moved back. He was standing at the far edge of the stage, and if you watch the footage carefully, you can see him turn briefly away, just for a moment, collecting himself with the focused discipline of a man who has a job to finish and is finding it more difficult than usual. When he turned back, his eyes were red, and he made no effort to suggest otherwise. He looked at the audience, which was undone in the uniform, unglamorous way of people who have been crying without preparation, and he laughed, the same helpless, wet laugh he had given in the room with Dorothy Turner and Maya Ackaffer, the laugh that comes when the emotion is too large for any single response, and the only honest option is all of them simultaneously. The audience laughed with him, and then they were all crying and laughing together, and the bright game show set was the most human room in the world. In the year that followed, Evelyn Cross did what she had always done with new information. She organized it thoughtfully and gave it the time it needed. She spoke to Thomas by phone twice a week in the early months and visited Boston in October, where she met his daughters Maria and Laura, her half-sisters, who received her with the particular warmth of people who have been told about someone their whole lives, and are meeting them for the first time, and finding that the reality is everything the idea prepared them for and more. She met Thomas's grandchildren, her half-nieces and nephews, and found in them, as Franklin Edwards had found in Amani, the unexpected joy of seeing family traits distributed through new faces, the laugh that is yours but not yours, the hands that are familiar from the inside, the specific tilt of a head that you have always done and now understand as something older than yourself. She met Catherine separately in New Hampshire in a lunch that lasted 4 hours and covered 60 years in the way that only conversations between the right people cover time. Not efficiently, but completely, with the willingness to go back and go slowly and say the thing that needs to be said even when it is difficult, even when it requires a particular quality of honesty that most conversations do not ask for. Evelyn brought Paul. Catherine brought her daughter, a woman of 38 named Susan who had known about Evelyn her whole life in the same way that Marcus and Devon had known about Clara, as a half-sibling who existed somewhere in the world, real and unmeetable, held in the family's awareness as both a presence and an absence. Susan shook Evelyn's hand at the door of the restaurant, and then, without entirely planning to, hugged her instead. "I've known about you since I was little," Susan said. "My mom she always said she thought about you." Evelyn looked at Susan, this half-sister she had not known existed 3 months ago, and felt the particular compound emotion of found family, the gratitude and the grief together, the joy of the presence and the shadow of the absence that preceded it, both true, both hers, both held. Thomas Bellini spent the winter after the reunion digitizing his photographs. He had boxes of them going back to the early 1960s, slides and prints, and the particular thick stock photos of the late 60s and 70s, and he scanned them one by one with the patience of a retired civil engineer who is good at careful, methodical work, and he sent them to Evelyn in batches with notes about the people and the places. Evelyn received each batch at her kitchen table in Vermont, Paul beside her with his tea, the two of them going through the photographs the way they went through everything, together thoroughly without rushing. She was building one photograph at a time the visual history of the family she had come from, learning the faces, learning the names, adding them to the complete sentence she was still, at 60 years old, in the process of reading fully for the first time. Steve Harvey spoke about Evelyn's story in a long interview given 6 months after the taping, and he said something that those who heard it found themselves repeating to other people in the weeks that followed, the way you repeat things that land somewhere important. He said, "What struck me about Evelyn was the grace. 60 years is a long time to carry a question. And she never, not once in anything I heard about her or saw in that room, she never let the question make her smaller. She let it make her more attentive, more present, more able to sit with difficulty without demanding that it resolve. She became a librarian, which is basically a person whose whole job is to connect people with the thing they are looking for. And I thought about that afterward. I thought she spent her life professionally doing for other people the thing she most needed done for herself, finding the right thing for the right person at the right moment." He paused. "I don't think that was a coincidence. I think that's what people do. I think we do in the work we choose and the lives we build. We do the work that means something to us because of the things we carry. And she carried it beautifully. She turned it into something." Another pause. "And then she got to sit at that table in New Hampshire with her birth mother and her half-sister and her husband, and I think about that afternoon sometimes. I think about Evelyn Cross having that afternoon. I think that's what all of it was for." Paul Cross planted a rose bush in the garden the spring after the reunion. Not for any particular reason he could articulate. He told Nathan it just seemed right, that the garden should have something new in it after a year like the year they had just had. It bloomed in June, red and full and slightly unexpected in its vigor, and Evelyn photographed it and sent the photograph to Thomas and to Catherine and to Helen in Providence and to Susan in New Hampshire. All the people who had been brought into her complete sentence. All the people who now knew her name and noted her birthday and sent her things in batches with notes about people and places. She sent the photograph without a message, just the image of the rose, because sometimes the thing you want to say is best said exactly that way, as a bloom, as a color, as an evidence of life continuing in its new and fuller form, asking nothing, offering everything. The question, after 60 years, had an answer. The answer had not resolved the life it answered into something simpler or easier or less complicated than it had been. It had made it fuller. It had made it louder in the places that had been quiet and quieter in the places that had been loud with the particular noise of unanswered things. Evelyn Cross was still a librarian and a wife and a mother and a grandmother and a grower of excessive tomatoes. She was still the woman who walked the quiet interior walks and sat with difficult things without demanding that they resolve. She was all of those things, exactly as she had always been, and she was also now the daughter of Thomas and Catherine and the granddaughter of people whose names she was learning and the half-sister of Maria and Laura and Susan, and these were not additions that sat on top of who she was. They were roots. They had always been roots. She had simply, at 60 years old, finally been able to see them. It is never too late. That is what Evelyn Cross gives us to carry out of this room today. Not as a motivational statement, not as a comfort offered cheaply to people in pain, but as a fact, demonstrated and verified, lived and real. 60 years is not too late. The question you have been carrying quietly, faithfully, through a full and good life that was real and true regardless of the answer, is still worth asking. The door you have been keeping slightly open, all this time against all reasonable expectation, is exactly the right door to keep open. The photograph in the wallet, August 9th noted in the mind, the registration in the mutual consent registry that waited decades for its match. None of it was wasted. None of it was too small to matter. All of it was the work of love doing what love does when it cannot go where it most wants to go. It waits. It keeps the details. It stays. If this story reached something in you today, and if you have made it this far, it reached something in you, please give it a like right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like Evelyn's. Share it with someone in your life who has been carrying a question they are afraid to keep hoping for, someone who has been keeping a door open for a very long time and is starting to wonder if they should close it. Tell them what Evelyn Cross would tell them. Don't close the door. Not yet. Not until you have sent the test and waited for the results and opened the laptop at 11:30 at night and looked again. Because 60 years from now, on a Thursday afternoon under the lights of a room you could not have predicted, someone might walk through that door holding a 53-year-old photograph. And you will want to be there. You will want the door to be open. Thank you for being here today. We will see you in the next one.